This is actually the most crucial and important piece of data on its own, which should have been enough to suspend it and actually suggest that it probably shouldn't have been rolled out in the first place, is that those trials that were done by Pfizer and Moderna, which led to all the media reports, 95, 100% effective, the approval by the regulator, the rollout, the coercion, the mandates, they were reanalyzed by some very eminent scientists, including the associate editor of the BMJ, one of the world's top epidemiologists, and they published in the journal Vaccine, which is the premier journal for vaccines. And they were able to get new data that was made available on Health Canada's website and the FDA in America's website. And what they did in their reanalysis of the original high-quality clinical trials is they found, Steve, you were more likely to suffer serious harm from taking the vaccine at a rate of 1 in 800. That meant hospitalization, disability, or a life-changing event, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. And this is during the early phase, right? This is during the most lethal strain.
For all age groups?
Yes, well, absolutely. Well, they put all age groups together. So on average in all age groups, that's a very good question. But what's missing is that actually, okay, is there a benefit that's greater than harm in certain age groups? But we can indirectly answer that in a second. So that was the original trial. So on average, it was more harmful than beneficial, okay? But even before talking about all age groups, Steve, a 1 in 800 harm rate for a vaccine is completely unacceptable in the sense that we have pulled other vaccines in the past for much less harm. The swine flu vaccine was suspended globally because it was found to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, a debilitating neurological condition, in 1 in 100,000 people. Rotavirus vaccine was pulled in 1999 because it was found to cause a form of bowel obstruction in children at 1 in 10,000. So you've already got a harm rate of 1 in 800, irrespective of, right? So that first and foremost should be a red flag to say, hold on, this is too much.
When they say harm rate, what's the range of definitions of harm?
Well, in this one, they categorize serious harm as it caused you to be hospitalized.
Yeah.
It caused a disability. Okay. Or something that was life-changing. Now, of course, that can incorporate lots of different things. But of those, and I spoke to the lead researcher, I know work with him on other things, 40% of those serious harms were actually related to clotting disorders like lung clots, heart attacks, etc.
I want to make sure I'm super clear here because I don't understand the data you're citing. So you're saying that they found 1 in 800 people would have serious harm or harm?
Serious harm.
Serious harm.
Serious harm.
1 in 800 people had...
In the trials. 1 in 800, yeah, 1 in 800, serious harm, right? Now, just to give you perspective so you can balance it out, just because this is important, it's a question you've asked is really important. We didn't have any good real world data at that point on, can we separate vaccinated from unvaccinated to look at what the hospitalization rate would be for COVID, for example, in people who took the vaccine versus the people that didn't, according to age group. That data in the whole world, the only country to make that data available was the UK. And they did that in the beginning of 2023, so January last year. And what did that show? After 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, Steve, if you were over 70, so this is the highest risk group, you had to vaccinate 2,500 people to prevent one person being hospitalized with COVID.
And this was with the different strain, the Omicron strain, because the original strain was...
Yeah, it was, you're right, it was with the Omicron strain. So that was still, but it gave us a ballpark figure that even that, so it's like, so say a patient comes to me and says, Doc, what are the benefits of this drug as a prevention, whatever else? And I say to them, well, if you take this, there's a 1 in 2,500 chance it will help you, prevent you being hospitalized. I'll be honest with you, Steve, I mean, in medicine, in all the drugs I've used and all the data I know about different medications and heart disease, etc., that figure, I mean, it's a very serious issue, but that figure is a joke. I mean, there's nothing of such poor. And then when you get to people under the age of, say, 50, you're talking about having to vaccinate maybe several 100,000 to prevent one.
Is that relevant for the first strain of COVID as well? Or do we not have the data on that?
No, we don't have that data on that. We do, in my paper, which I published, actually, we did have some data on Delta. And if I remember correctly, the data on the over 70s, there's also problems with this a little bit because it's not corrected for other factors, such as socioeconomics, etc., risk factors that might make people more vulnerable. So if I remember correctly from that paper, if you're over 70, that was about 1 in 250. Delta was the worst strain, actually. So about 1 in 250. Okay.
On the British Heart Foundation website, I'm sure you've read this. Just to read out what they say on there. It says that up to 1 in 10,000 people with the Pfizer vaccine are at risk of myocarditis or pericarditis. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah.
Up to 1 in 10,000 people for the Moderna vaccine. And it's not possible to estimate other vaccines because they're not frequently used in the UK. All 3 of these COVID-19 vaccines are mRNA vaccines designed to target the Omicron strain. And at the top of this, it says the risk of myocarditis or pericarditis after COVID-19 vaccine is very low. How do you respond to that? Do you think you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with it at all. I think there are a number of layers to respond to this. I think the first thing to say, Steve, is the British Heart Foundation, with the greatest respect to them, and they do a lot of good work, overall is still part of the so-called establishment, which has been blinded for years to actually even address so many issues on health when it doesn't suit the interests of Big Pharma. And I can say that categorically because I know one of the chief advisor to heart disease for the British Heart Foundation, with the greatest respect to him, is a guy called Professor Rory Collins at the University of Oxford. And they have said similar things when it comes to statin drugs, which we'll talk about later. But that person, the people who advise them, are people who are heavily funded and linked to pharma, their institution taking hundreds of millions, for example. So there's a huge bias there to start with. That's the first thing. But for me, what the British Heart Foundation are not doing is actually countering, and I would love them to counter that because I'm very open for the debate here, is that you've got a reanalysis of, and they know this, the best way of determining serious harm from any drug is actually one of the best ways is the highest quality level of evidence, which is the randomized control trials, which is what led to the approval. When you've got an independent reanalysis in a peer-reviewed journal saying more harm than good from the beginning, that in itself, and then we look at real world data, Steve. There's so many other bits of data that they are ignoring. Basically, to answer your question, they're ignoring lots of other data, which is very clear, whether it's autopsy data, whether it's other studies that came out of Israel that showed, for example, this was published in a journal called Nature Scientific Reports. And again, they ignore this. They don't talk about it. So it's like, hold on, guys, you're ignoring, you're not even mentioning this data. They showed, and this is really most disturbing. In 2021, there was a 25% increase in heart attacks and or cardiac arrests in people aged between 16 and 39, which was associated with the COVID vaccine, but not associated with COVID.
Do you believe that if we hadn't have introduced the vaccine, more or less people would have survived COVID? Because I've got close friends of mine that got COVID and I watched them go from very healthy looking people to basically skeletons. Good friend, one of the CEOs of my company, his dad went from being a very healthy man to being basically looking like a skeleton and almost died. And then I know of other people that did die. So I think in the grand scheme of things, when we think about vaccines, was it a net positive that we had a vaccine?
There is, from everything I know now, I have slowly and reluctantly come to the conclusion that the COVID vaccine introduction has had a catastrophic overall net negative effect on the population and society. And one of the, and let me just caveat this, because you've mentioned the fact that people suffered from COVID, and I'm not denying that. I've got patients, Steve, that I see that have had long COVID, that weren't vaccinated, okay, and have suffered quite badly. Most of the most serious aspects of COVID happened early on in 2020 and predominantly affected the elderly. We've got all of that data now that's been reanalyzed by one of the world's top scientists. And even looking back now, essentially, if you were under 70, even from the beginning, your risk of serious harm from COVID is in the ballpark figure of the flu, right? And even I actually was wrong. I wrote an article in European Scientist in April 2020, because I actually initially started making a lot of noise about why we're not talking about lifestyle with COVID to help people mitigate, improve their immune system. And I said, talking to a friend of mine who works in the busiest ER in America, in New York, who I've done work with, and he said, Aseem, I've never seen anything like this. This is devastating. Some of my colleagues are dying. So I have no doubt that at the very beginning, in the early strain of the virus, it was really bad, especially for vulnerable people with obesity, etc.
Because even I remember getting COVID. I used to live on the top floor of this building, and I remember I've never experienced anything quite as bizarre as the symptom set that I had when I got COVID. The fact that at 3 a.m. in the morning, I don't take medicine, so the fact at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm lying flat on my floor ordering ibuprofen on Uber Eats because my back, I just had the most bizarre back pain. And so I was having to lie flat on the floor because I couldn't even lie in bed. It was so bad. It's just this weird set of symptoms that I'd never had before. My partner, she lost her smell and taste, and it was so unusual. It was so unusual. There's not been a time in my lifetime that people have lost their smell and taste en masse. So when you hear it compared to the flu, you go, this was not the flu. This is something different.
Yes. No, the symptoms are very different. And I think now it's accepted that, and we won't go into a lot of detail on it, but I think one of the reasons as well, it was human engineered. It almost certainly the evidence points to it being a lab leak, right? So it had you're right, it was very different to any other virus.
That used to be a conspiracy theory.
I know, right?
Now it's not a conspiracy theory.
I know, exactly.
It's funny, when you hear about that lab in Wuhan that were messing around with viruses, and then we decided to put the blame on a market stall. But I think now the general consensus is that it probably came from that lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I've spoken to, in fact, I spent time with actually the scientist that first went public with it, who identified it, guy in in Australia. That came from a lab. But so I think it had these different strange things, loss of smell, etc. But in terms of serious illness, it was there at the beginning. Now, when you look back, I think essentially there were vulnerable elderly, but who suffered, especially people in nursing homes. There were a lot of deaths there. But there's so many other components to this. So one is, did we institute the correct treatments? A lot of people were killed because they weren't managed properly in ITU, in terms of intubating them, putting on respirators when they didn't need it. And that in itself has a risk. Some of the wrong treatments were given. There were other treatments now that we look back that probably would have been helpful. Things like ivermectin, which I know has been a bit controversial, but it's very safer than paracetamol, right? So first do no harm, okay? But it may have done some good, and a lot of people and doctors around the world that used it in several thousand. There's a doctor in South Africa that used it in 14,000 patients, including many elderly. Not a single one died from COVID, and this is early on. So all these things that we missed a lifestyle intervention. So all those things are there. But by the time you get to the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, there are so many things that happen, Steve, that you have to think about before you introduce a vaccine. One is, what is the state of the virus right now? And it had already mutated to some degree and become less lethal. There is natural immunity, which we know is very powerful, right? But the issue with the vaccine is, and certainly it was probably there from the beginning, we know that when one looks at the original trials, there was and this is what the drug companies have done for a long period of time, they will mislead people using statistics about the benefits. So use something called relative risk reduction. So let me just explain this, because you can apply this to statins as well. Is they presented the benefit as a 95% protection against infection. Remember that figure, 95%, right? And it was what we call relative risk reduction. So if you've got, for example, two groups in a trial, say 100 in one trial, in one group and 100 in another, and let's give you an example of statins, and you're following them up over 5 years to look at a drug to see if it benefits them in preventing having a heart attack. In one group, they get the dummy pill, and you follow them up over 5 years, and in the people that got the dummy pill, in fact, you didn't do anything different. 2 of them suffered a heart attack. In the other group, the other 100 people that were followed up over 5 years, who got the pill, the drug, right? Only 1 suffered a heart attack. So you've reduced the heart attack risk by 50%, right? 2 to 1, right? 50%. But you've only prevented 1 heart attack. You've treated 100 people, but you've prevented 1 heart attack out of treating 100. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's a 1% absolute benefit. In other words, when you explain that to a patient, when I have engaged in sort of what we call informed consent, shared decision making, when they ask me about drug, I'll say, this gives you a 1% chance. if you take this drug religiously, of preventing a heart attack. Now, you apply that to the original COVID vaccine trials, which, by the way, have so many other problems with them because even those trials were conducted and analyzed and designed by the drug industry. I mean, this is one of the biggest myths that needs to be busted, Steve, out there for most doctors, as well as members of the public. Medical knowledge is under commercial control, but most people don't know that. So what happens is they did the trial, but let's just talk about what the results, their results showed us. A 95% relative risk reduction against infection. They didn't show any reduction in COVID death, by the way, in that trial, right? They just said prevent from infection, but we then presume it may then prevent, right? Reduce death rates. The absolute risk reduction from infection at the beginning was 0.84%. 1 in 119. So that's how many people you need to vaccinate to prevent one infection, which actually people were not told. So imagine you're thinking, should I take this vaccine? You say, well, Steve, there's a less than 1% chance that it's going to prevent you getting infected. People weren't told that.
But it then reduced my chance of getting seriously ill, right?
No, but we've then talked about that, haven't we? Like, as in when you look at the data, certainly beginning of 2023, that was looking over the previous year, 2022, you have to vaccinate 2,500 people to prevent one person getting seriously ill with COVID, right? If you're over 70.
With the other strain, but that was
with the other strain, and it may have been better, Steve. You're right. It probably was better, but it's still, numbers are still much smaller than what people were led to believe. And by the way, Steve, the narrative at the beginning, they kept changing the goalposts. Remember, it wasn't about preventing serious illness and death. It was all about preventing infection. You are not in America. You've seen it all over CNN. Rachel Maddow, and she's saying it so passionately. If you take this vaccine, you are not going to get COVID. And calling anyone who questions it being a science denier. I mean, Jesus Christ.
So my last question on that before I said what I was going to say is, do you think there would have been less deaths overall if we hadn't have had a vaccine?
Yes.
You think there would have been less deaths?
By now, when you look at it. So I think over time, so where we are now.
Start? So if we hadn't have introduced the vaccine for that first strain of COVID, do you think there'd be less deaths?
Okay. If I was to, I still think that this is very nuanced, but important. If the vaccine had only been offered to the high-risk people at the beginning, say the over 70s or people with multiple risk factors, I think there is a case to be made. Right? I'm going to counter that in a minute though, but there is a case to be made that there was overall benefit versus harm. But there's a problem. One, there wasn't true informed consent, right? Because those figures, those numbers weren't given to people about the prevention of infection, etc., right? And two, if you have an average serious harm rate of 1 in 800, any scientist, even regulators would have said, hold on a minute. This is way too high. This is too risky. And this is, by the way, Steve, only the short term. Because remember, this vaccine didn't go through what other vaccines have gone through, which is 5 to 10 years of safety testing. So if you throw all those caveats in and use informed consent, I can guarantee you with all of my knowledge, expertise, experience with patients when you engage in these conversations, most of those elderly people will probably have still refused it. But yes, I think there is a case to be made that the benefits may have outweighed the harms in those high-risk people at the very beginning in the short term. Absolutely.
You know, when I think about Rachel Maddow and what she said on TV about, you know, it's going to stop the spread of infection, etc., I can have a degree of empathy because if that's the information you're being fed and you are a public-facing broadcaster and it's being fed to you by scientists and it's been fed to you by the NHS and whoever else, and, you know, very credible people that you've been raised to believe and to trust. If you're a public-facing broadcaster, what else are you going to say? You're not going to say the opposite. You can't sit on the fence. Your job is to broadcast. It's the news, right? So I think you did the same. You said earlier you went on Good Morning Britain or something and said the same.
I'm not blaming Rachel Maddow here. I'm just saying that the indoctrination that came through the mainstream media was so strong through people like Rachel Maddow. And why is that important, Steve? I had a conversation with the chairman of the British Medical Association in December 2021 when I was campaigning to overturn vaccine mandates for healthcare workers. He had access to Sajid Javid. I had a previous rapport with Matt Hancock, but he had obviously left by then. And I spoke to his name's Sean Nagpal, and I explained to him everything I knew about the vaccine. after looking at data at that point, I hadn't published at this point, but I went through it in a logical way. Chairman of the BMA, by the way, not just some random person. And he said, Aseem, no one appears to have critically appraised the evidence on the vaccine as well as you have from our 2-hour chat. Most of my colleagues who are in senior policy, medical positions, establishment positions, are getting their information on the benefits and harms of the vaccine from the BBC.
It's super difficult.
Isn't that extraordinary, though?
I think it's really difficult because if you're dealing with lots of people dying en masse and it's happened very, very quickly and people are just dropping dead and you're seeing, hospitals being overrun, you've got to tread carefully with the information you're putting out there. So if the scientific information comes in early and maybe a little bit too soon before it's really been vetted and triple checked, saying one thing, and you're desperate for answers, I can see why a group of people would say, okay, this is the best information. And then to go against that information could potentially cause tons of harm. So I can also imagine why a group of people would be really slow to then change their mind away from it. Because you're dealing with lots of people. And
Steve,
dying.
I was that person too.
Yeah.
So I'm with you on that, 100%.
Yeah.
I think where I'm taking this is the system, if it had been more transparent early on, and this is where I've been, banging my head against a brick wall to some degree for about a decade. If there was more transparency in the system, we would have had better information even from the beginning. But that information was kept commercially confidential because of the system that really is geared towards supporting the interests of big pharma, not in the interests of people's health. And that's the key point here. Right. We're looking back over time thinking, how did this happen? How do we allow this to happen? We need to go deeper. Say, how do we stop this happening again in the future? So we have better information.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously. And the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.